Okay, let's dig into this. When you think about strategic genius, sometimes the biggest move isn't the one everyone expects, right? We often focus on land battles, forts on hills, but this deep dive, looking at the sources you shared, it really highlights something else for Shivaji Maharaj, building power at sea. That was kind of revolutionary for the time.
It really was. And what stands out is the foresight. We're talking about a period where, most Indian powers were focused inwards on land. But Shivaji, he grasped the importance of the coast. There's that quote mentioned in the material, something like, water is as important as land.
Yeah, one who controls the seas, controls the trade and security. That quote really sets the stage, doesn't it?
It perfectly captures his thinking. And it wasn't just a theoretical idea.
Right. The sources make it pretty clear why he poured resources into the Samudri Sena, his navy. It wasn't a side project. First off, protecting the Konkan coast, that long western stretch, it was vulnerable.
Hugely vulnerable. Piracy, raids. It was constant, so defense was paramount. And then there's trade. Those sea routes along the Arabian Sea, absolute lifelines for the Maratha economy. They needed defending.
Definitely. And it wasn't just about pirates. It was about the established foreign powers already there.
Exactly. You had the Portuguese, the cities of Janjira, who were, formidable adversaries at sea, and the British East India Company starting to flex its muscles.
So the Navy was also about challenging them, pushing back.
Precisely. Contesting their control, stopping their free run of the coast, and, importantly, giving Shivaji the ability to launch his own attacks from the sea.
Yeah.
It shifted the dynamic.
Okay, so it's defense, it's trade protection, and it's projecting power against rivals. That makes sense. So how did he actually do it? Building a navy from, almost scratch?
That's the fascinating part, detail in the sources. He set up shipyards, proper shipbuilding centers, places like Kharwa, Kalyan, Bhiwandi, Malvan.
So they weren't just buying ships, they were building their own fleet.
Building and adapting. The materials mentioned different types of vessels. You had the Gallivats, fast, shallow draft, good for attacking quickly.
Like coastal raiders?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the larger Gurabs, more like proper warships, better armed. And PALs, slower, mainly for transport, carrying troops or supplies. A mixed fleet for different jobs.
And a fleet needs bases, strong points.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
The sources point to key sea forts. Sindhudurg is maybe the most famous, built right on an island. Tough to spot, strategically brilliant.
Right, the material notes how it almost blends into the sea, and Vijaydurg.
Another major one. Huge walls, a protected harbor. Essential. Plus others like Jaigad, Kharwa. These weren't just forts, they were naval hubs.
And you need people to run it all. Leaders.
Hill commanders, yeah. The research names admirals like Darya Sarang, Mai Nayak Bandari, Daulat Khan, and later figures like Tukoji and Gray became prominent. These were the guys translating the vision into reality, fighting tough battles.
So this whole effort, the ships, the forts, the people, what were the results? What advantages did it actually deliver?
Well, coastal security definitely improved, like we said.
Yeah.
Less vulnerability for the coastal population and trade, and that directly helped the economy. Safer seas meant more reliable trade, more revenue.
Okay, economic and security benefits. What about militarily?
It gave the Marathas a whole new angle of attack. Surprise raids on enemy ports, disrupting their shipping. It really challenged those foreign powers. The Portuguese, Siddis, British, they couldn't just dominate the coastline unchallenged anymore. Shivaji's navy was a serious obstacle to their ambitions.
So when you look at the big picture, the sources seem pretty consistent.
Yeah, they credit Shivaji as essentially the first Indian ruler to strategically build a navy as a core part of his state's power. Not just a few ships for raiding, but a planned state-backed force. That's why he's often called the father of the Indian Navy. It's about that strategic vision, the forts, the fleet. It fundamentally altered the coastal power balance.
Right. So wrapping this up, this deep dive, based on the info you provided, it really underscores that strategic thinking means looking beyond the obvious. We see the clear need for the Navy, the powerful enemies he faced, the real benefits, economic, military, and you can still see the legacy in those sea forts today.
It shows how shifting focus, even centuries ago, could challenge established powers and anticipate where future threats might come from. Not just land, but the sea.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you. Thinking about Shivaji facing down those established European navies back then, what does his early grasp of sea power tell us about how crucial it is, even now, to really understand and anticipate all kinds of potential threats wherever they might come from? Something to consider. Okay, let's get into it. We've got some really interesting sources here today focusing on somewhat, pretty central to the start of the Maratha Navy, Mai Nayak Bandari.
That's right. And our goal, our kind of mission for this deep dive, is to use these sources to really understand who he was and maybe more importantly, why he mattered so much,
Yep.
especially for the Marathas, who we often think of as, land-based power.
Yeah, and the sources don't mince words. They call him the first naval hero of the Maratha Navy. That's a significant claim right off the bat.
It really is. It signals he's not just a commander. He's someone, foundational.
And we get his full name, Mai Nayak Bandari, from the Bandari community.
Exactly. The sources point that out. A community with deep seafaring traditions. So this isn't someone totally new to the sea being put in charge. He comes from people who knew the ocean.
Right. So Shivaji Maharaj is turning his attention seaward, a big strategic move, and he finds someone with that inherent maritime skill. Makes sense. So where did Bandari operate within Shivaji's command structure?
He served directly under Shivaji Maharaj, a senior naval commander. You can almost think of him as one of the very first admirals, really, in this brand new navy.
An admiral in a navy being built from scratch. Wow. And his patch. Where was he based?
The sources specify the coastal Konkan region. That's his primary area. We're talking places like Kalyan, Thane, and crucially, near the stronghold of Janjira.
Ah, Janjira. So not exactly a quiet posting then. This was the sharp end.
Definitely the front line against very established sea powers.
Okay, so this is where it gets really fascinating, I think. Shivaji has this vision, right? Don't be hemmed in by land. The sea is crucial for trade, defense, projecting power. Quite forward-thinking for Indian rulers back then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Mai Nayak Bandari seems to be the person right there, making that vision a reality on the water.
He wasn't just taking orders, he was shaping it.
That's what the sources imply. He was instrumental in forming what they call India's first organized navy under an Indian ruler, one of Shivaji's earliest naval appointments. And his expertise was practical patrolling, defending, launching those swift sea attacks.
And that deep knowledge of the local area must have been key. The sources talk about his familiarity with the Konkan coast, the sea routes.
Oh, absolutely critical. Knowing the ins and outs, where to patrol, where enemy ships might be, where you could hide or strike from. That local knowledge is a massive strategic advantage in itself. You can't just learn that from a map.
Let's talk enemies. Who is he facing out there? The sources mention some tough opponents.
Top of the list, probably the cities of Janjira, a major naval force, controlling that incredibly strong sea fort. Mai Nayak Bandari was right there, leading the fight against them.
So actual combat engagements?
Yes. The sources mention battles near Kalyan and Dandarajpuri, where he led Maratha naval forces. His Bandari sailors, using their community skills, put up a real fight against the city fleets. It wasn't easy. The cities were formidable.
So taking the fight to the enemy, but also defense, right? Guarding the coast must have been huge.
Huge. He was a master of coastal defense, it seems. Protecting that whole Konkan belt from pirates, yes, but also from European powers, like the Portuguese who were active there.
And securing those sea routes, that's not just about stopping raids, is it?
No. It's about protecting the flow of Maratha supplies, enabling trade. That's the lifeblood for the kingdom's economy, its war machine. It connected the land forts to the sea, basically.
And speaking of forts, his involvement with naval forts comes up too.
Yes, those sea forts were absolutely integral to Shivaji's strategy. Places like Sindhudurg, Kharwa, Jaigad, Vijaydurg. Mai Nayak was involved in protecting these vital points. Holding these let the Marathas control the coast and project power.
Okay, let's try and summarize this based on what we've discussed from the sources. Mai Nayak Bandari emerges as, a foundational figure, a founder of the Maratha Navy.
A brave sea fighter against major threats like the Siddis and the Portuguese too.
A master of coastal defense, protecting those vital sea lanes and trade routes.
And involved in securing those crucial naval forts. It's a picture of someone laying the essential groundwork.
Yeah, the sources really paint him as instrumental in building that strong, organized navy, something quite unique for its time in India.
And that foundation, those early struggles and successes, that paved the way, didn't it?
It set the stage for later figures.
Exactly. You can see how his pioneering work, as described here, created the basis for later famous admirals like Kanhoji, Ungray to build upon. Mai Nayak Bandari is really that vital starting point, a genuine hero of the Konkan coast, you could say.
So here's something to maybe leave you thinking about. What does it tell us when a leader like Shivaji, with key figures like Mai Nayak Bandari, decides to build naval power essentially from zero? How does that fundamentally shift a kingdom's potential, its place on the map, moving beyond just land warfare? What does that foresight mean? And, well, what does it teach us even today about the importance of the sea while mulling over? Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving deep into a figure with a really evocative title, Chief of the Sea. We're talking about Darius Sarang. He was a key high admiral in Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's very early navy, back in the mid-1600s.
Right, and that's a pretty crucial point because Shivaji, who was, mostly known for his land-based power at the time, he saw that having a strong naval presence was absolutely essential, especially along that vital western coast.
Yeah, building a navy, an organized one, basically from scratch must have been a huge task.
Oh, definitely. And getting the right people in charge, well, that was paramount.
Exactly. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to dig into the sources we have on Darius Sarang. What was his background, what did he actually do, and why was his specific know-how so important for Shivaji's plans for securing that whole coastline?
Well, what's really fascinating, and maybe a key thing that jumps out from the sources, is where Darius Sarang actually came from. It seems he wasn't just like a general told to manage ships. The evidence points to him being from a coastal warrior community.
Okay.
Which suggests Shivaji wasn't just thinking military structure. He was strategically bringing in this deep inherent knowledge of the Arabian Sea, understanding its currents, its moods.
The geography, all of it. So it wasn't just military tactics, it was tapping into this lifetime, maybe generations of really intimate environmental knowledge.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the sources show he rose pretty quickly, became one of the main naval chiefs as early as the 1660s, right when the Maratha Navy was really starting to form.
Right.
The accounts really highlight his deep knowledge of the sea, strong leadership, in fights and just managing the ships, and also his loyalty, his bravery.
And that expertise, it sounds like it paid off quickly.
Yes, absolutely. It translated straight into action. We see in the research he was instrumental in challenging the powers already there. The ones who dominated the West Coast for ages, like the Portuguese, controlling trade, and the very formidable Siddis, especially around key spots like Dandarajpuri and Janjira.
Just south of modern Mumbai, right?
Exactly. So right in the thick of it against major rivals.
So, okay, he was leading ships in battle, but what else? Did the sources show him doing other things?
Yeah, they point to another really critical role, his involvement with the sea forts. Shivaji's coastal control wasn't just about ships floating around. It relied heavily on these fortified bases along the coast. And Sarang, he was key in guarding them, organizing the forces at these strategic spots.
Look at Sindhudurg.
Sindhudurg's a perfect example. Sources say it was specifically built to control the Arabian Sea, and Sarang's command there was vital. Or Gallivats Fort that was used as a base for quick sea raids.
That kind of control, it needs constant watchfulness, right?
Definitely. And the sources also mentioned he was responsible for the day-to-day patrolling, covering a huge stretch of the Konkan coast.
From Malvan, way down south, up towards, what's Mumbai now?
Right. And that patrolling, it wasn't just routine sailing. It was foundational work for maritime security. Spotting enemy ships, protecting Maratha ones, messing with opponent supply lines, that kind of thing.
So his impact wasn't just single battles?
No, not at all. He's really recognized as one of the very first commanders of an organized, sort of independent Indian Navy.
That early leadership, clearly it had a big impact, helping Shivaji actually secure a big chunk of that western coast, keep the Konkan safe.
Indeed. That title, Chief of the Sea, it wasn't just for show. He was a genuine expert in sea warfare strategy. They say he understood everything, tides, winds, different ship types, how best to use them in a fight. His bravery, his expertise seem unquestionable, and underscored by that loyalty to Shivaji Maharaj his whole life. Of course, naval command later shifted, to families like the Angries. But Darius Sarang's pioneering work, it had already laid some really essential groundwork.
He's remembered then as this brave warrior, patriotic commander, a really pivotal figure in early Indian naval history.
So thinking about all this, for you listening, how does understanding figures like Darius Sarang change things? These leaders who built naval power by mixing military strategy with this really deep local environmental knowledge.
Yeah, how does that shift your perspective on historical power, maybe defense, especially for coastal areas?
What stands out to you about that blend, that mix of intimate sea knowledge and broader strategic vision you see in leaders like him? Something to mull over. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a stack of sources, focusing on a figure absolutely crucial to the early Maratha Empire, though perhaps, less celebrated than he should be, Daulat Khan. We've got articles here, some historical notes, research, covering the mid to late 1600s.
Right.
Our mission today is to really unpack these sources and get a feel for the significant sort of foundational role Daulat Khan played right alongside Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj.
Yeah.
Especially in building and protecting that vital Maratha naval power.
That's exactly right. Shivaji Maharaj's incredible land campaigns get a lot of the focus, and, rightly so.
Sure.
But his vision for a strong navy was equally revolutionary and, well, absolutely critical for the Maratha state's survival and growth.
Okay.
And our sources consistently highlight Daulat Khan not just as a part of that early maritime force, but really as a foundational pillar.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this then. We'll look at the context, why this navy was even needed in the first place. Then we'll dive into who Daulat Khan actually was, how he came to join Shivaji, his specific vital roles, some of the key actions he was involved in, and ultimately why his contribution was just so essential to Maratha history.
Exactly.
This deep dive is specifically for you, the listener, to get a clear, comprehensive picture of this important commander and his impact.
Sounds good.
So let's set the scene first. Why did Shivaji Maharaj, his base was initially inland, right? Why did he need a navy at all during the mid to late 1600s?
Well, the sources make it very clear. The Konkan coast, this long stretch of coastline where Maratha power was expanding, it wasn't just vulnerable from land, it faced constant, serious threats from the sea.
Sure.
We're talking about formidable rivals like the cities of Janjira. They were a strong local naval power, and also those established foreign powers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, they were all operating in these waters.
So a lot going on there.
A lot. And if you couldn't control the sea lanes, you just couldn't truly secure your territory. You couldn't protect your burgeoning trade routes or support the forts along the coast.
Makes sense.
Shivaji Maharaj recognized this incredibly early on. He understood that a strong maritime force wasn't some kind of luxury. It was essential for defense and, state building.
Right.
This led him to take the pioneering step of establishing what one source actually describes as India's first navy under his leadership.
Wow. So it wasn't just about land battles then. It was about projecting power and defense onto the water itself.
Precisely.
And for that, he needed not just ships, but skilled sea warriors, commanders who really knew the coastal waters.
Exactly, skilled people.
And this is where Daulat Khan enters the picture.
This is where he comes in.
Okay, based on the sources, tell us about Daulat Khan himself.
Okay.
What's his basic background and profile?
So the notes and articles identify him pretty straightforwardly as a naval officer, a key sea commander within that nascent Maratha navy. He served directly under Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, operating extensively in the coastal Konkan region and the southwestern sea during that crucial mid to late 1600s period. And he worked alongside other early naval leaders that the sources mentioned too, like Darya Sarang and Mainayak Bandari.
Right, those names come up too. What kind of community or background did he likely come from, did the sources say?
Yeah, he's described as likely originating from a coastal warrior or maybe a traditional seafaring community.
Okay.
And this is significant because it means he would have already possessed, inherent skills in seamanship, navigation, coastal warfare expertise that was absolutely vital.
So stuff you can't just learn overnight.
Exactly. Not easily acquired inland, that's for sure.
And do the sources give us a sense of when and how he actually joined Shivaji Maharaj?
Yes, they point to his joining happening around the 1660s.
Okay, so pretty early on.
Very early. This time frame is key. It's right during the critical foundation phase of the Maratha Navy when Shivaji was actively building this force, basically from scratch.
Right.
The location was the coastal region of Konkan, likely near areas like the major ports or naval bases being developed, places like Malvan, Jaigad, or Kalyan.
Got it.
And Shivaji Maharaj, he wasn't just gathering men, he was actively identifying and recruiting brave, capable sea warriors, people who had proven skills. And importantly, people he could trust. Loyalty was key.
Absolutely.
Daulat Khan was clearly one of these early loyal commanders who answered that call. The sources suggest Shivaji recognized his specific abilities, skills in patrolling, expert ship handling, combat experience on the water.
So very specific skill sets.
Yes, and he quickly entrusted him with significant command responsibilities. His existing expertise, his loyalty, his bravery, It made him an invaluable asset right from day one.
So he wasn't someone who learned on the job with Shivaji. He was brought in because he already had the skills they desperately needed right at the very beginning.
That's the picture the sources paint, yes. He brought the expertise with him.
Okay. The sources really detail the specific roles Daulat Khan played. Beyond just being a commander, what were his main responsibilities day to day?
Well, he led patrol ships and smaller fleets, yes, but his role, it went much deeper than that. He was essentially the Maratha Navy's first line of constant vigilance along that coast.
Okay, the eyes and ears.
Exactly. The sources emphasize his strategic thinking and his bravery, not just in, pitched battles, but during the routine sea patrols and those critical quick response missions.
Right. What areas was he responsible for keeping secure? Was it the whole coast?
He was given specific charge of patrolling the southern Konkan coast.
Ah, the southern part.
Yeah, think of it as his beat, his area of responsibility. His mission there was relentless. Keep it secure from those persistent threats we talked about. The Siddis coming up from Janjira, the Portuguese trying to assert control, and potential incursions or disruptions from Dutch and British ships just navigating the area.
So a very active zone.
Extremely active. And he also had a crucial, almost logistical role with the sea forts, didn't he? The sources mentioned that.
Absolutely. This was a major part of his contribution, actually.
Yeah.
He acted as a critical link for the key sea forts along that coastline, places like Vijaydurg, Jaigad, Kharwa.
Okay.
His role was coordinating with these forts from the sea, which was incredibly difficult, dangerous work.
I can imagine.
It wasn't just about defense, it was about making sure these isolated outposts were regularly supplied with essential provisions, food, water, arms, even reinforcements.
Wow.
Keeping these forts guarded and ensuring they could communicate effectively, especially when threatened by enemy fleets, that was a constant high-stakes operation he was overseeing.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare, frankly, especially on potentially dangerous waters.
It really does.
What kind of ships would he be using for this, and what were his preferred strategies? Small ships.
Yeah, the sources mention he commanded small naval fleets, primarily using those light and fast ships, the Gallivats and Gurabs that were common in the region then.
These weren't massive warships, not like the European ones, but their strength was in their agility.
Okay.
They were perfect for the shallower coastal waters of the Konkan and could often outmaneuver larger, slower vessels.
So using the environment to their advantage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And his strategies leveraged this. They focused on effectiveness, things like surprise attacks, using speed and knowledge of the coastline to hit and fade before larger enemy ships could properly respond.
Guerrilla tactics at sea, almost.
In a way, yes. He was also critical in protecting Maratha cargo ships moving along the coast and actively disrupting enemy trade vessels, which was a way to hurt rivals economically,
Right. Hitting them where it hurts. That raises an important question we see touched upon in the sources. How crucial exactly were these specific types of light, fast ships and these surprise tactics for the early Maratha Navy's success, especially against often larger European or city vessels?
That's a really great point, and the sources imply it was absolutely fundamental. The Maratha Navy, initially at least, didn't have the resources to build huge ships of the line like the Europeans could.
Right.
Their strength had to come from something else. So by mastering the use of these fast coastal vessels and employing those hit-and-run tactics, they could contest control of the waters, they could protect their own traffic, and they could make the coast incredibly dangerous for invaders, even invaders with superior firepower in open water.
Okay.
It allowed them to, punch above their weight, especially in their home territory.
So he wasn't just fighting. He was part of figuring out the right tools and the right way to use them for this unique coastal environment.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He was adapting.
It sounds like he really covered everything from continuous patrolling and defensive coordination to that critical logistical support and even offensive disruption on the sea.
A very multifaceted role, definitely.
The sources also mention specific types of actions he was involved in, even if they weren't always grand, named battles like on land. What kind of engagements did he participate in?
Yeah, they list several key types of actions that seem to have kept him constantly busy.
Like what?
Well, there were frequent skirmishes with the cities. These weren't always large fleet battles necessarily,
Right.
but often involved defending key coastal towns or smaller ports from cities' raids, using his maneuverable ships to repel attackers close to the shore.
Okay, defensive actions.
Yes. And then he was continuously engaged in naval patrol missions. These were critical for routine security, obviously, but specifically focused on protecting Maratha trade ships and ensuring royal sea routes were safe from piracy or any kind of hostile interception. This was essential for the state's economy.
Vital.
Then there were the fort supply operations we mentioned. These weren't just logistics. They involved navigating dangerous waters, maybe breaking through loose blockades, or dodging enemy patrols just to get supplies through to those isolated forts.
High risk.
Very high risk, high reward activity. And finally, there were encounters with the Portuguese. The sources mention him helping resist Portuguese attempts to control coastal movement or enforce blockades on Maratha ports. These were often tense standoffs or sharp, localized fights just to keep those sea lanes open.
So it sounds like less like single decisive clashes and more like constant vital actions, a continuous effort to maintain control and deny access to rivals along that coastline.
That's a very good way to put it. A constant pressure, a constant presence.
So considering all these contributions then, the constant coastal protection, leading the early fleet, that challenging fort coordination, ensuring maritime trade security, what was his overall importance in Maratha history, according to these sources? How significant was he?
Well, he was, quite simply, a first-line defender of the Konkan coastline. That's huge.
Yeah.
At a time when the Maratha state was rapidly expanding inland, he ensured their vulnerable flank on the sea was protected from some pretty formidable enemies.
Right.
The sources consistently highlight him as one of the absolutely founding officers who directly helped Shivaji Maharaj translate his vision into the practical reality of creating that navy.
So foundational is the word.
Foundational, yes. And he was noted for his unwavering loyalty and commitment to Shivaji's mission.
Okay.
What's also fascinating here, and the sources mention this, is that he wasn't just a commander. He also acted as a naval mentor.
Oh, interesting. What does that mean?
It means he was actively training other smaller commanders in these vital skills, patrolling techniques, coastal navigation, effective sailing, and the specific strategies that worked for the Maratha fleet.
Oh, passing on the knowledge.
Exactly. This was crucial for building the Navy's capacity beyond just that initial set of officers Shivaji recruited, building depth.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It explains how the Navy could grow and sustain itself.
Yeah.
But if he was so crucial, why is his name, as we noted, less famous today compared to, say, Kanhoji Ungre? He became the legendary Maratha admiral maybe a generation or two later, right?
That's a really interesting question the sources touch on, and it's a point of historical curiosity, I suppose.
Yeah.
They acknowledge his name is less frequently mentioned in popular history today, but they are very clear that in Shivaji's own time, he was known. He was known as a committed, capable commander, constantly handling these high-risk, essential sea tasks.
So his reputation was solid then?
It seems so. The sources suggest a few possibilities for why he's less known now, though it's not, definitively stated.
Okay.
One is simply timing. He may have retired or perhaps passed away, or maybe his active command period just ended before Kanhoji Ongre rose to prominence.
Right.
Ongre then became the central figure in later Maratha naval history, which is, in some respects, maybe better documented or captured the popular imagination more.
I see. So later events overshadowed the beginnings a bit.
Possibly. Early foundational periods can sometimes be overshadowed by later, more consolidated eras. It happens in history. However, his legacy, according to these sources, remains significant. He is clearly remembered as a foundational pillar of Shivaji's early naval system.
Okay.
He was an early naval hero, crucial to the establishment of what's called India's first real indigenous sea force under Shivaji Maharaj.
Right.
His key role was establishing that naval power and security in coastal areas where control of the sea was absolutely essential for the Maratha state's defense and its ability to trade and, well, prosper.
So while his name might not be as instantly recognizable today, he was absolutely essential to getting Shivaji's ambitious maritime project off the ground.
Yes.
And really laying the groundwork for future Maratha naval strength.
Couldn't have happened without figures like him, it seems.
Okay. So we've unpacked these sources on Dullah Khan.
Mm-hmm.
We've looked at his profile, his joining during that critical early phase, his multifaceted roles in patrolling, fort support, commanding the fleet, his constant actions against coastal threats, and his vital importance in establishing Shivaji's navy.
Yeah, he emerges as a loyal, skilled, and truly foundational commander operating at a time of intense challenge on the Konkan coast.
Right.
He ensured the safety of that crucial region and was instrumental in building the very bedrock of Maratha sea power. His story is, I think, a powerful reminder that major historical achievements often rely heavily on the dedicated, sometimes less celebrated, work of foundational figures like him.
The ones who build the systems.
Exactly, the ones who build the systems and defenses from the ground up.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this deep dive?
Well, it means understanding that historical power isn't built just through famous, decisive battles, right?
Right.
It's also built through strategic vision, like Shivaji, recognizing the need for a navy, and the very specific, vital, often day-to-day contributions of individuals in specialized, sometimes dangerous foundational roles, like Dalat Khan's work in the early Maratha Navy. And this raises, I think, an important question for you to consider. When we look at historical narratives, are we maybe giving enough weight to the figures who established the crucial systems, the ones who managed the complex logistics, ensured the day-to-day security,
Right.
rather than just focusing on those who led the most famous charges? How many other foundational figures, essential to the fabric of their time, might be waiting to be rediscovered? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Imagine trying to build, well, the capital city of an empire. Not on some easy flat plain, but way up high on a mountain, designed to be, unconquerable. Today, we're looking into the mind behind that amazing achievement. Shivaji Maharaj. He was the chief architect for Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we study the Maratha Empire, we often talk about the battles, the big leadership moments. But empires, they need foundations.
Yeah.
Literally. Secure places to govern from, ways to feed everyone, and defenses that, well, actually work against tough enemies.
Absolutely. And that's exactly where Shivaji Maharaj fits in, this deep dive. It's based on the sources you've shared with us. They really help us understand the huge, but maybe sometimes overlooked role of this master builder. So our mission today is to figure out how his architectural genius, especially with places like the incredible Jaigad Fort, was just so essential to Shivaji's whole mission.
It really is a look at the strategic planning behind the history. It goes beyond just the battles.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Who exactly was this key figure? So, based on the sources, Shivaji Maharaj had this very specific, very crucial job. Chief architect. The Igraji, the Polonjajo for Shivaji Maharaj.
Right. And the sources are pretty clear. He wasn't just, some talented guy who showed up out of nowhere. He came from a background, a family that was really steeped in architecture and engineering. It wasn't just something he learned. It was like in his blood, a craft passed down.
And he was active right in the middle of things, the mid-1600s, during Shivaji Maharaj's reign. We know him mainly for designing Jaigad Fort, the capital. But the sources hint he might maybe helped with ideas for Sindhudurg too, the sea fort.
Possibly had some input there, yeah. Though his main known work was definitely for Shivaji Maharaj himself. And that family background coming from a community of builders, that's a really important context. Before he even met Shivaji, he would already been, pretty experienced, probably working on temples, maybe smaller forts, other buildings for local chiefs. He wasn't starting fresh.
And the sources really point out his specific skills that were just perfect for the kind of landscape Shivaji was dealing with, like his deep knowledge of mountain terrain architecture.
Yeah, and that's absolutely critical. Think about the Western Ghats, those really rugged mountains. Building securely there, that takes a special kind of understanding. Slopes, rocks, the whole environment. And tied to that, his skill in water management, just as vital.
Yeah.
Imagine, a whole capital city, thousands of people stuck on top of a cliff during a siege. Water's everything.
Right. Storage, supply, all of it. And then there's his expertise in security-based design, specifically for forts.
These weren't just about strong walls. It was smart design, thinking about how enemies might attack, using the building itself as part of the defense. Clever stuff.
So not just general building skills then?
No. Highly specialized. Things that directly solve the problems of building and defending in the Konkan region. That tricky, hilly coastal area. His skills were about using the land, turning it into an advantage. Survival, really.
Okay, so he has this unique skill set honed over time. How does he actually end up meeting Shivaji Maharaj?
Well, the sources seem to place it around the early 1660s. And the timing there, it's really significant. It lines up with a huge strategic choice by Shivaji Maharaj.
Ah, the plan to move his capital.
Exactly. He was shifting from Rajgad to what would become Jaigad.
And that wasn't just packing boxes, right? This was establishing a brand new, powerful center for the whole Maratha state.
Precisely. And for that, Shivaji didn't just need a builder. He needed someone exceptional. Someone who really understood fort architecture, yes, but also safety, strategic planning, on a capital city scale. And the sources suggest Shivaji Maharaj, with his reputation, that family background in forts and even town planning, He kind of came onto Shivaji's radar specifically for this job.
So it sounds like less of a chance meeting and more like Shivaji deliberately seeking out the exact right person.
I think that's exactly what the sources imply. It really shows Shivaji's foresight, doesn't it? He understood that making this new capital work, making it secure, needed top-tier architectural and planning skill. Finding Hirooji wasn't just hiring a builder, it was a key move in building the state itself.
Which brings us right to his biggest, most famous contribution, Jaigad Fort. He wasn't just helping out, he was the main architect, the one shaping the heart of the Maratha Empire.
Yeah, and the sources go into quite a bit of detail about the strategic thinking behind Jaigad's design. He used the natural landscape brilliantly. The fort's location, high up, made it naturally protected from the start. It wasn't just convenient, it made it strategically strong right off the bat.
And what always amazes me reading the sources is how he designed it to be a whole functioning city. It had to handle administration, house soldiers, contain the palace, have markets for trade, and crucially, manage its own water. All inside a fort on a mountaintop.
It's an incredible feat of integrated planning. And the sources give us specific examples, like the Raj Bhavan, described as Shivaji Maharaj's palace, but for living and for working, dual purpose.
Or the Nagar Khana, the main gate. The sources even say it had a specific spot for, like, a musical welcome for important visitors. So not just functional, but with that touch of imperial ceremony built in.
And then there was the Rani Mahal, a separate palace area for the queens. Shows planning for different needs, different residents within the fort.
Okay, here's where, according to the sources, it gets really interesting. The marketplace. Described as a two-sided road market system. Now, why is that such a big deal?
Well, think about it. You're on a cramped mountaintop. Space is limited.
Right.
This structured layout, it didn't just look neat. It maximized that space, allowed for organized trade, which is vital if you're cut off in a siege, and probably helped manage crowds and security too.
And those water tanks. Described for drinking, bathing, collecting that essential rainwater.
That system was the fort's lifeline. Absolutely essential for holding out during a long siege. Reliable water.
Wow.
What's fascinating here really is how all these pieces fit together. He wasn't just designing separate buildings. He was designing a whole resilient, working city inside a fortress. And, the inclusion of the Jaigad temple near Shivaji's own samadhi, that shows the cultural and spiritual side was integrated too.
So beyond the living spaces, his brilliance really shone in the actual defenses, the fortifications. The sources talk about things like hidden escape routes. Vital, I imagine, if things got really bad.
Absolutely critical for contingencies. And the walls themselves weren't just straight lines. He used angled defenses. Imagine trying to climb that wall. Defenders on the next section over could fire down on you. Creates a lethal crossfire.
Makes a direct attack much, much harder.
Incredibly costly for attackers, yes. And strategically placed watchtowers giving overlapping views, covering blind spots.
And the sources stress the real-world effect of all this, right? Jaigad survived a lot of attack.
It did. Numerous attacks by major powers, like the Mughals and the Siddis from Janjira. The architecture itself was a massive part of the defense strategy.
It was just strong, it was smart.
Precisely. The design aimed to make attacking incredibly difficult, not just absorb blows. And while Jaigad is the main focus, the sources do mention he might have helped with initial ideas for Sindhudurg Fort.
The sea fort.
Yeah, which suggests his strategic mind wasn't just limited to mountain forts. Though, as the sources note, Kanhoji Angri was the big name there later on. Still, that potential early input from Ndolkar is interesting.
So if we try to pull it all together, what's the legacy of Hirooji and Ndolkar based on these sources? What's the big picture?
Well, the sources really paint him as a true master of fort architecture. They stress his smart use of local stone, his mastery of slope engineering, making buildings work with the steep mountain slopes, not against them. Great. Leveraging the terrain itself, and those innovative water systems, of course.
And he's credited as the main designer of Jaigad, one of the most iconic Maratha capitals ever. The sources call him a genius in strategic planning. His designs balancing defense and, well, city life seem way ahead of their time.
Definitely. And he was clearly respected in Maratha history, known as Shivaji Maharaj's chief planner, chief architect. But there's a point the sources make that's really powerful, and I think worth emphasizing. He wasn't a warrior. He didn't fight in battles.
Right.
Yet his contribution is described as being equal to that of a military general.
Wow. That comparison really stops you. How can an architect's work be seen as equal to a general's in, historical importance?
Well, it makes you think about how we measure impact, doesn't it? Hirooji Ndolkar didn't lead charges, But his planning, his designs, they protected thousands, soldiers, civilians, everyone inside those forts. The forts he designed became the literal backbone of Maratha defense. Secure bases to operate from, safe places to fall back to. So if you connect this to the bigger picture, his ability to create these secure, self-sufficient, strategically brilliant spaces, that was just as vital for the Maratha state's survival and success as any victory on the battlefield.
So his genius in planning and building actually enabled the military and the rulers to do what they did.
Exactly. One couldn't succeed without the other.
It really drives home how different kinds of talent, different kinds of genius shape history. It's not always the famous battlefield names.
Precisely. There's more to the story.
So why should you, listening to this, care about someone like Shivaji Maharaj? Well, understanding roles like his, the chief architect, the strategic planner, it reveals something deeper about how history actually happens.
Yeah, it shows that the story isn't just about the famous leaders or the big battles you read about. It depends just as much on those brilliant, maybe less famous, minds behind the scenes. The ones planning the infrastructure, the logistics, the foundations. People like Shivaji and Dulkar, whose designs literally sheltered people and enabled an empire. They were absolutely crucial.
It makes you think about today, too, doesn't it? All the unseen planning, the engineering, the design work that goes into, I don't know, big infrastructure projects or even city planning.
It does. That need for smart, strategic design hasn't gone away. It's fundamental.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Shivaji and Dulkar and the architecture of empire, here's something to think about. How might that kind of strategic architectural or system design still be working today? Maybe as a powerful but often invisible force, perhaps in urban planning or designing resilient systems against disasters, or even in building secure cyber infrastructure.
It's still about building systems, whether they're physical or digital, that are not just functional on the surface, but are inherently strong, resilient, and give you a strategic edge.
A different kind of power, a different kind of strength. Fascinating stuff. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take the sources you put together, articles, notes, all that research, and well, we jump right in to find the core insights.
Exactly. No fluff, just getting straight to what matters in the material. We're here to help you navigate it all.
And today, we're looking at a really interesting figure from Maratha history, thanks to the material you sent over on Shivaji Maharaj.
Yes, a naval commander. These notes and articles you've provided give us a good starting point.
Our goal here is to figure out, who this Shivaji Maharaj was, what he was up to, and how he fits into that whole story of the Maratha Navy.
And critically, based on your sources, we need to clear up a key potential confusion point right from the start.
Good point. So let's dive in. Who exactly was Shivaji Maharaj? The sources identify him as
Shivaji Maharaj, sometimes spelled Angria. He was a commander, a naval officer, and importantly, part of that very well-known Angri family.
Right. The Angras were huge in the Maratha Navy. And the timeline. The sources place him when exactly?
Latter half of the 17th century, but really more into the early 18th century. That's his main period of activity.
Okay, early 1700s. And that timeline is really important, isn't it? Because it addresses that question you mentioned.
Precisely. The big question your sources seem to want clarified. Did Shivaji Maharaj serve directly under Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj?
And the answer, looking at the dates you've highlighted from the material, is a clear no.
Absolutely not. It just doesn't line up. Shivaji Maharaj's reign, his main active period, was roughly 1645 to 1680. He passed away in 1680.
Okay.
Then you have Shivaji Maharaj, who's probably the most famous Angara admiral. He really established their naval power starting around, say, 1698, and he was dominant until his death in 1729.
So even Shivaji comes quite a bit after Shivaji's time.
Correct. And Shivaji Maharaj, based on these sources, really steps onto the main stage after Shivaji dies in 1729.
Ah, I see. So Shivaji is definitely the next generation. He wasn't a contemporary of Shivaji Maharaj at all.
That's the key takeaway from the timeline presented in your sources. He served under Shivaji's successors and operated within the Angara power structure built by his father, Shivaji.
There's just no record suggesting he ever met or served Shivaji Maharaj himself.
None presented in the material you shared, no. He inherited a situation. He wasn't there at the very beginning with the founder.
Got it. And speaking of that Angri family legacy, your sources emphasize how central they were, right? They became the Maratha Navy's chief admirals.
They really did. Shivaji Maharaj in particular gets the credit for building up this serious naval force along the Konkan coast, made them a real power, especially against the European traders and navies.
But then, as you said, Shivaji dies in 1729. The sources mention this as a turning point. What happened then?
Well, that's where Tokoji really comes into the picture more prominently. The sources describe how Kanhoji's power didn't just pass to one person, it was divided among his sons.
Oh, interesting. So Tokoji, Sambhaji, Manaji Angar, they were all involved.
Yes. They carved up the command and the territory, essentially. So Tokoji is part of that phase, trying to continue the legacy, but also dealing with, family divisions after the main leader was gone.
Okay, so he's in command, post-Kanhoji, with this strong naval force, but also internal family politics.
Yeah.
What kinds of things was he actually doing? What activities do the sources mention?
A lot of conflict, basically. The sources show him involved in plenty of naval skirmishes. He was fighting against the British, the Portuguese too, trying to maintain Maratha control on the coast, sort of continuing his father's fight.
Right, pushing back against those growing European powers at sea.
Definitely. But it wasn't just external threats. The sources you provided also point to significant internal conflict, specifically a power struggle with his brother Manaji Angar.
Over what?
Over control of Jaigad Fort, a really key strategic location.
Wow, okay, so he's fighting the British and his own brother for control of vital assets. Sounds intense.
It does. It adds a whole layer of difficulty, doesn't it? And the sources also show him commanding other important places, like Vijaydurg. These forts were the backbone of their coastal power.
Did his role go beyond just fighting and forts? Was he involved politically, according to the sources?
Yes, they mentioned that too. He seems to have been involved in the court politics of the time, sometimes aligning with the successors of Shivaji Maharaj, the Maratha king. So his influence wasn't purely military.
Okay, so if we look at his specific duties, the day-to-day stuff outlined in the source material, what does that look like?
It paints a pretty comprehensive picture. First, coastal defense. Managing those forts, keeping the Konkan region secure from sea attacks. That was fundamental.
Makes sense. And commanding the fleet itself.
Absolutely. Naval command. That meant leading the ships, the sailors, organizing patrols, directing operations.
And then there's the practical side.
Right, the logistics. Ship maintenance is mentioned, overseeing the shipyards, repairs, maybe even some shipbuilding. And also, importantly, managing the sea trade that passed through their waters.
Ah, that point about regulating trade and collecting tribute or taxes from merchants. That's fascinating.
It really is. It shows the Angry Navy under him wasn't just a defensive force. It was projecting power, controlling the sea lanes, generating revenue. It shows the extent of their authority.
Okay, let's try to pull these threads together then, based strictly on the source material you've given us. What are the absolute key takeaways about Tokoji Angria?
All right. First, definitely a warrior, a naval commander. No question there.
Second, he did not serve Shivaji Maharaj directly. He belongs to the next era. That seems crucial based on your sources.
Crucial clarification, yes. Third, he served under his father Kanhoji initially, but later acted more independently, though often alongside, or sometimes against, his brothers and interacting with the Maratha rulers.
Okay. Fourth, his main contributions.
Protecting the Maratha coastline, leading naval operations, and actively resisting the growing influence of the British and Portuguese, continuing that fight.
Fifth, his major battles involved those coastal wars against European powers, but also those internal family fights, like the one over Gallivats Fort.
Exactly. Can't forget the internal dimension. And finally, sixth, his legacy, as presented in these sources, is really about his effort to maintain the Angra naval dominance after Kanhoji during a much more fragmented and challenging period.
So, thinking about his overall significance, the sources suggest he's maybe not as famous as Kanhoji.
Probably not, no. Kanhoji casts a long shadow, but Tokoji's role was still vital, according to this material.
He was holding things together, wasn't he? Maintaining that naval presence in the early 1700s despite huge pressures.
Yes, and those pressures were both external from the Europeans and internal, those family divisions the sources highlight. That split after Kanhoji's death must have really hampered things.
Which makes his achievements, like holding on to key forts and keeping up the resistance, seem even more significant, perhaps.
I think so. He was operating in a very complex, very difficult situation. His story, as laid out here, really exemplifies a wider historical point, doesn't it?
Which is?
The challenge successors face. How do you maintain the vision, the power, the unity established by a foundational figure like Shivaji, or even like his own father, Kanhoji? It's often much harder than building it in the first place.
That's a great point. So bringing it back to you, the listener, why does digging into Tokoji Angre, based on these specific sources you've provided, actually matter?
Well, because looking at figures like Tokoji, the ones who come after the legends, gives you a much richer, more complete picture of history. It's not just about the famous founders, it's about how things continue, how they change, how legacy is actually managed or sometimes fumbles.
Right. His story, with the external enemies and the internal family feuds,
Hmm.
makes those challenges very real, very tangible. It's not just abstract historical forces.
Exactly. It's about leadership under pressure from all sides. And understanding his specific jobs, coastal defense, fort management, tribute collection, that gives you a concrete sense of how a historical naval power actually worked on the ground, or rather on the water.
It makes it feel less like a history lesson and more like, well, real life back then.
Hopefully, yeah, more grounded.
So we've really explored the material you shared on Tokoji Angre. We've clarified that timeline issue regarding Shivaji, looked at his role after Kanhoji, and detailed the actions and responsibilities highlighted in your sources.
Yeah, we've established he was a key figure in that post-Kanhoji period, continuing the naval resistance but facing those tough internal and external challenges.
Thank you for bringing these sources to us and joining this deep dive. It's a complex and important story woven through them.
It absolutely is. Glad we could explore it together.
And reflecting on Tokoji Angre's situation, it leaves us with a thought, doesn't it? Something to mull over. When a powerful vision and legacy are set by a founder, how do the leaders who come next successfully navigate both the external dangers and the internal divisions to keep that legacy not just alive, but thriving for the future?